This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Hello and welcome to the IIEA, and particular welcome to Cecilia Malmström, our guest today, who will be talking on the issue of international trade. It is, of course, a turbulent time for the international trading system with the return of tariffs, an erosion of multilateralism, and a change in the geopolitical environment that's bringing protectionism and security concerns back to the fore. Today, Cecilia will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. Everything is on the record. You can put your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So let me just briefly introduce our guest today before giving her the floor. Cecilia Malmström served as the European Commissioner for Trade from 2014 to 2019, and as European Commissioner for Home Affairs from 2010 to 2014. She was a member of the European Parliament from 1999 until 2006. She was also Minister for EU Affairs in the Swedish Government from 2006 to 2010. She joined the Peterson Institute for International Economics as a non-resident senior fellow in June 2021, where she hosts the Peterson Institute's Trade Wins event every week, which is a most informative discussion on trade for those who are looking for more information on trade. So without further ado, Cecilia, thanks again for joining us, and can I hand the floor to you?
Thank you very much, Dan, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here again, because this is not my first time. We will talk a little bit about tariffs and trade today. I'm not sure I agree with President Trump that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, but it's certainly one of the words most used by me and many others the last month. We do live in a world of tariff, and this has created quite a lot of turbulence in the global trading system. How did we get there? Because the turbulence started before President Trump. Well, a lot of things have happened the last year that has affected the trading system. COVID, of course. We saw the massive closing of ports, borders, factories. Workers could not go to their work. And trade was, of course, affected by this in the beginning. But remarkably quickly they recovered, and trade found its way, and companies learned how to become better at resilience, diversification, regionalization, etc. The last year has also seen a pressure on trade to take into account the need for greening, the climate transition and the carbon transition, and the need also for trade to play a more important role in that transition. That affects, for instance, shipping industry. There are also demands on emissions on the ships. And we have seen the emerge all over the world, actually, of ways to try to put a price on carbon, both nationally, but also in trading effects. And this is, according to most economists in the world, a very good way of addressing the issue of emissions. You can put carbon pricing in different ways, in taxes or ETS systems or something else. And the EU has the most ambitious one, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that is now being rolled out. And all this is good for the environment. But the problem is that we have 73 different jurisdictions of carbon pricing of different kinds in the world. And when they are not sort of coordinated, it creates tensions. And we see that a lot of countries in the developing world are accusing EU for sort of green protectionism, etc. This can be solved, but it is for now a source of tension. We have also seen a wave of subsidies sweeping all over the world, in the EU, in China, of course. During President Biden, we saw the IRA. And subsidies are not necessarily a bad thing if you want to correct where the market can't deliver. The problem is when it's not transparent, and when rich countries do it to an extent that poorer countries cannot compete in the same way. And then we have also seen the national security notion or geopolitics entering into the trade policy. We saw that when China got upset with Australia because they criticized China's handling of the COVID crisis. So boom, Australian wine was basically banned from entering China. We saw it also when Lithuania wanted to open an office for Taipei, Taiwan, in their capital Vilnius. This was also something where China said is an attack on our national security, and they punished Lithuania with trade measures. President Trump, during his first mandate, also referred to national security when he put quite high tariffs on steel and aluminium. And we have seen countries referring to national security when, for instance, when limiting exports of materials that are very much in demand in the world, notably critical minerals and rare earth. Also, of course, Russia's export of oil and gas has been used for geopolitical reasons. And if all this was not enough, we also see a weakening of international organizations more broadly, but notably when it comes to trade, to the WTO organization. WTO has not been able to deliver updated modern rules for the global trade. It is hard and difficult to make decisions, and many countries are violating its rules. So all this, of course, plays in to the global trading system. In comes President Trump in his second term. As you will recall, he talked a lot about tariffs during his whole campaign, and it was expected that he would use them as an important tool. He increased tariffs against China very early in his mandate, and quite early also, again referring to national security. He put 50% tariffs on steel, aluminium, and copper, and later also on cars. And he's also looking at medical devices and pharmaceuticals under the same national security item, which is a special provision in the American law. Liberation Day, as you might recall, the 2nd of April, was a moment where he also addressed another kind of tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, based on the idea that the rest of the world has been abusing the openness of the US market, and that trade balances are unfair, and this needs to be corrected. So you will recall when he stood there in the Rose Garden outside the White House and throwing out figures to the world. The EU got 20% tariff at that time, but some countries got 10, others 40. And it was a quite turbulent weeks followed after that. The markets reacted quite strongly as well. President Trump believes truly, and he has spoken about this since early 80s, that tariffs are a good thing, and that the rest of the world are abusing and taking advantage of the US. So these so-called reciprocal tariffs will seek to correct that. He also wants to force companies to move production to the US, to restore manufacturing production in the US that has diminished quite considerably the last decades, and of course companies to invest in the US. But then he also sees tariffs as a quite handy political tool. I don't like your migration policy, tariff. I don't like that fentanyl comes into my country, tariff. I don't like the way you treat my friend Bolsonaro, tariff. And also criticizing countries when it comes to consumer rules, to tech rules, as we have in the European Union, and notably the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and other sort of call of green legislation that is making life for American companies more difficult and complicated, according to him. So countries hurried up to make deals, as you will recall, and the EU made a deal as well this July. It's not a beautiful deal. It's not even really a deal because it's not legally binding. But there was an agreement to have a 15% across the board tariff towards the European Union. It was 20 on Liberation Day, and then it went up to 30, and then now it's 15. Steel and aluminium are still 50%, and car tariffs are at 30. They were supposed to go down to 15. We haven't seen that happening yet, to the great disappointment of the motor industry in Europe, who are very dependent on this. There was also a decision that the European Union, not as an institution, obviously, but companies in the European Union would invest in the US up to an amount of 600 billion euros. Furthermore, the European Union would buy energy and weapons for 750 billion euros. Obviously, these figures will be very hard to follow up and to monitor, but they were presented as a very good deal. The EU is also moving to operationalize some of these, eliminating tariffs mainly on goods and some agricultural products vis-à-vis the US. They are now with member states and in the European Parliament, but the US will still have 15%. So we have the highest tariffs between Europe and the US since the end of the Second World War. And this is, of course, bad because we do trade a lot with each other. 4 billion euros a day travels of value. We trade with each other. And this economy supports 16, 17 million jobs. Of course, we are very interdependent and we will continue doing so. We just need to find new ways to deal with it. There is a possibility that the European Parliament will reject the tariffs or at least make amendments. Let's see. So why wasn't the European Union tougher? Well, there was a lot, as you know, it is the European Commission who negotiate on behalf of all the member states, but there was a lot of coordination going on. And the EU had a long list of possible retaliation that was negotiating with all the member states. There was a pressure from several countries not to escalate the situation and to seek clarity and predictability. Also, over all politics in the European Union hangs the issue of Ukraine. There was big fear that the US would withdraw from their engagement in Ukraine, and as you know, it's going back and forth in this regard. The problem is that we are probably putting ourselves into a situation of perpetual negotiations, because just a couple of days after the agreement was made in Scotland, the president, the US administration came out and said, well, you have to abolish your tech rules, you know, the rules that we have that regulates tech companies, the Digital Market Act, the Digital Single Act, the AI Act, for instance, and that there's pressure on the EU to loosen them up. So there will be these kinds of demands coming back, I think. So what shall we do now in the European Union? Other countries have similar deals. The UK has a deal as well. Japan, South Korea are desperately trying to get a deal. Vietnam has a deal. Other countries have deals. The developing world, of course, have less clout. But most countries have actually accepted the terms and the narrative of the US administration and have entered into deal. So what shall we do? Well, I think the European Union needs to be calm, don't panic. It will be turbulent. There will be new pressure. There will be new demands. We cannot react to everything coming from the White House, but we need to be prepared that it will be turbulent for another 3.5 years, most likely. In the meantime, we shall continue working with friends and allies. In the WTO, is they have problems, but it is still working, and there's a lot of efforts trying to maintain, but also develop the system. So with the friends and allies there, we should continue doing this. Furthermore, we must try to de-risk from the US. The EU as a body, as 27 countries, trades approximately 18% with the US. That means that more than 80% is with someone else. So those kind of friendships and alliances must be strengthened. We have a lot of free trade agreements with the world, with important economies such as Japan, Canada, Vietnam, Singapore, UK, New Zealand, South Korea, several countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. We are negotiating at this moment, we as Europeans, with Australia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and India even. And that must, of course, continue and try to bring them to a close. Just yesterday, the EU concluded an agreement with Indonesia, something that has been in the making for many, many years. And that's, of course, a very important signal to our companies in Europe, but also to the world. The EU is about to ratify agreements done with Mexico and the 4 countries of Mercosur. if the Mercosur agreement enters into force, this will be the biggest trade agreement in the world, 850 million people. And of course, also a very important geopolitical statement with friends and allies in Latin America. With China, it's a complicated relationship. We trade a lot with China. We will continue to trade with China, but also there is a de-risking taking place, notably when it comes to our dependence on rare earth and minerals, where China dominates the whole value chains in many of these minerals, and we are very dependent on them. So there is an effort to try to de-risk and to seek other kinds of relationship and alliances to get access to these minerals. Notably, Indonesia, of course, is an important partner in this regard. It's one of the biggest nickel producers in the world, and nickel is needed, and all these materials are needed in the green transition, in the digital transition, and in the arms industry as well. Maybe the most important thing for us to be resilient vis-a-vis whatever happens in the White House is to be more resilient ourselves when it comes to our economy. We have homework to do. You've all heard about the Draghi report, the Letta report, on what we need to do to strengthen the internal market, which is a jewel in the European Union, but still with a lot of untapped potential. There was actually a report coming from IMF in July, I think, saying that the obstacles, the technical obstacles still present in the internal market are equivalent of a tariff of 44%, which is a lot. I don't really know how they calculated this, but it's still a signal that there's so much we can do. And we have tried this for years and we know what to do, but we need to continue that reform work. And the Draghi report laying out almost 400 proposals, some more difficult than others to achieve, but pointing to the fact that Europe is lagging terribly behind US, China, and other economies when it comes to innovation, competitiveness, our capacities for new technologies, and so on. So the Commission is now trying to roll out proposals based in the Draghi report and also in the Letta report, simplification, investments in new technology, AI, quantum, etc., batteries, trying to facilitate for small companies. And there are lots of things happening, but Draghi himself complained the other week that is too slow. It needs to be stepped up. Of course, some of his proposals require quite a lot of money, and that money must come from member states. So it takes time to agree upon this. But there are lots of things happening in this, so we can create more growth internally and use the potential of our internal market for ourselves, but also because it's such an asset for trading partners all across the world. So where will all this end? Well, it's really hard to say. Tariff is a tax. And who's paying the tax? Well, companies and ultimately consumers, of course. To this date, there was a lot of expectations that US inflation would rise quite rapidly after this massive amount of tariffs. That has not happened in the beginning. I also think many companies in the US were prepared for the tariffs, so they have been doing a lot of stockpiling during months. Now that is starting to become more difficult, and we see a slight increase of inflation, of unemployment, less investments coming to the US, and of course still the uncertainty of where the US market is going. Will this affect consumers? Well, we see increase in prices for ordinary Americans for consumer goods such as, shoes, certain agricultural products and items that an ordinary family buys regularly. Will this affect the political debate? It hasn't really so far. We see some movements of complaints of higher prices. There is in a year the midterm elections. Will the Democrats be able to use this? But we also have to acknowledge that a lot of money has come into the American budget, and the president is using that now to lower taxes and to sponsor the agriculture community, etc. Eventually, it will have an effect, and also American companies, if this tendency for countries to do trade agreements with each other continue, there will be effects felt that the American companies are not there to benefit of these this preferential treatment and this access to other countries' markets. But it's still hard to do. I think there was an initial shock in the world that this would happen, but we do see a de-risking and an increased activity also outside the European Union. China is definitely de-risking and trying to conclude trade agreements with the rest of the world. The CPTPP group of 12 countries that was actually created by President Obama to build a trans-Pacific alliance against China is one of the most dynamic trade agreements in the world. There are attempts from the European Union to work closer with the CPTPP countries to see if we could together we would be 40 countries, almost worth 42% of global GDP. If we can develop trade, set up new rules and standards, and also push for some WTO reforms. As you know, UK is a member of the CPTPP, and there's a long list of countries who have signed up as candidates, notably China, for instance, which is an interesting irony. But this is a very dynamic field of countries who are trying to set up new rules, not only liberalizing markets and increasing market access, but also liberalizing and harmonizing standards and setting new standards. So this is probably the way forward also for Europe. Try to be a bit calm, be prepared for constant negotiations, but take them slowly as they come, and building alliances, trade alliances, but also other kinds of partnership, as we do in the security area right now. There's a lot to talk about, coalition of the willing, but that is probably the way forward. And most countries of the world do want to trade in a way that it's based on predictable rules, transparency, and international norms and standards. They have served us very well. They are still there. I spoke to Dr. Ngozi last week. She is the Director General of the WTO, and she said that the world trading system is, of course, shaking, but still 72% of all global trade is still done under the WTO rules. So this is a majority, and there are 166 countries within the WTO. Most of them want to see what can be done, how can we preserve, not only keep, but also develop the trading rule. There will be a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulties in the years to come, but this is probably the only realistic way forward.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.